Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be talking about something that you might not really have thought about before, the history of human rights. We tend to think of human rights as, just universal and timeless, something that's just always been there.
Right.
But what if I told you that our modern understanding of human rights is surprisingly recent?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, right? We sort of view these rights as, fundamental and almost like the bedrock of, a lot of our moral thinking and political thinking. But the funny thing is, they haven't always been a central focus. And this is something that Samuel Moyn, the author of Last Utopia, really kind of I think throws a wrench into a lot of conventional thinking on this topic. He says that human rights are actually the last utopia, and they emerge after a lot of other big ideas kind of had their moment in the sun. Think communism, think revolutionary movements, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So right out of the gate, Moyne is kind of flipping the script, right?
Yeah.
He's arguing that human rights didn't just, flow naturally from these ancient traditions or even from events like the Holocaust or the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Right.
He actually says, and this is a direct quote, human rights commonly appear in journalistic commentary and in political speeches as a cause both age-old and obvious. At the latest, both historians and pundits focus on the 1940s as the crucial era of breakthrough and triumph. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement, right?
It is. It is. It's very striking, and I think it challenges some of our assumptions about how history works. We tend to think of history as this linear march toward greater enlightenment.
Right.
But I think, the reality is a lot more complex.
So if the 1940s wasn't this grand unveiling of human rights,
Yeah.
what was going on with them at the time? Like, how were they perceived? Where did they fit into the kind of global landscape?
Yeah. So Moyn points to a couple of key things that were happening. He talks about the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also the 1968 UN Conference.
Okay.
And he uses these as example of events that, while undeniably important, weren't really centered on human rights as we understand them today.
Wait, the Universal Declaration? I mean, this is like the document that supposedly lays out like the essential rights of every human being. You're saying that wasn't the main focus. How is that possible?
Well, I think you have to consider the political climate at the time. The world was just coming out of World War II. There was this huge focus on rebuilding, on preventing another global conflict. The horrors of the Holocaust were obviously very fresh in everyone's minds.
Right.
And there was this sense of urgency to address those specific atrocities.
Okay.
Rather than formulating this kind of broader framework for, universal human rights. In fact, Moyn even calls the declaration a funeral wreath for wartime hopes rather than a bold new beginning.
A funeral wreath. That's a pretty stark image.
Yeah.
So even with something as monumental as the Universal Declaration, human rights were still sort of in the background.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And then, you fast forward to 1968, which was, a year declared International Human Rights Year by the UN. And there was this major conference in Tehran. And again, you would think this would be the moment, right? This is where human rights are front and center.
Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer, right? You have a human rights conference, that's what they're going to be talking about.
But actually, the dominant theme at that conference was national liberation, not individual rights.
Really?
Yeah, imagine that. The world's on the brink of all this massive change, and human rights aren't even the top priority.
So if not in the 40s, if not in the 60s, when do human rights actually take off? I mean, was there like a specific event or a, I don't know, like some big turning point that suddenly puts them on the map?
That's the interesting thing about Moyn's argument is that there isn't this one single event.
Okay.
There's this, it's more of a confluence of different factors that kind of come together in the 1970s. And that leads to what he describes as almost like an explosion of human rights language and activism.
Okay, I want to hear more about that.
Yeah.
So what changes so dramatically in the 70s? Give us a sense of what that looked like.
Well, think about groups like Amnesty International.
Okay.
They were founded earlier, but it's in the 70s that they gain global recognition. Politicians like Jimmy Carter start to incorporate human rights into their platforms and start talking about it as a lens for foreign policy. Even the media undergoes a shift. Moyn cites this incredible statistic from the New York Times. He says in 1977, they used the phrase human rights almost 5 times more than in any previous year.
Wow. That's incredible. That's a massive jump.
It's huge.
So what was happening in the 70s that made it such fertile ground for human rights? Like, was it just random chance that everything kind of clicked at that moment?
Moyn argues that it wasn't random at all. In fact, he says that one of the key things that was happening was the decline of other utopian visions. So, for example, communism starts to lose its luster, especially after events like the Prague Spring. And then you have all these revolutionary movements that had once seemed so full of promise, they either start faltering or they descend into violence.
Okay.
And there's this growing disillusionment with these grand ideologies, a sense that, they haven't really delivered on their promises.
So as these other big ideas lose their appeal, human rights are kind of there to step in. Yeah. It's almost like they were waiting in the wings, waiting for their moment.
Yeah. It's a very interesting thought, isn't it? And I think if you think about your own life, there are those moments when you become disillusioned with something you once believed in, and it often opens you up to new possibilities, new ways of thinking about the world.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. When one door closes, you start looking for other doors to open. But this idea of human rights as the last utopia, I mean, did that late arrival, this sort of stepping in after other ideologies faltered, did that come at a price? Because, I mean, human rights are all about challenging systems of power, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think that's where a real tension emerges because to gain influence, to actually achieve their goals, human rights had to become more integrated with those very systems that they were initially critiquing.
So there's this inherent conflict. To challenge power effectively, you have to operate within the structures of that power.
Yeah, it's a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, it seems like a really difficult balancing act.
It is, and it raises, I think, some profound questions about the long-term trajectory of human rights. So, how do you maintain that critical edge while working within the very system that you're trying to change?
This is already making me rethink how I view human rights. It's not this simple, straightforward story that we often hear. There's a lot more nuance and complexity to it.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm sure there's a lot more to unpack as we delve deeper into Moyn's argument.
Yeah, definitely. As we're talking about the surge in human rights awareness in the 1970s, it's important to remember that, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. I mean, there were specific events and trends that were happening in the world that helped push human rights into the spotlight.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, right? What were those factors that kind of aligned to create this perfect moment for human rights to take center stage?
One of the key things that Moyn talks about is the search for a European identity after World War II. So you have this, Europe is deeply divided. It's caught between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But by the 1970s, there's this growing desire for a unifying identity, something that goes beyond just political alliances.
So they were looking for something that could kind of bring them together despite their differences.
Exactly.
Something that could transcend the political divide.
Yeah, and human rights kind of fit the bill perfectly, right? It provides this moral framework, this shared set of values that could unite a continent that had been fractured by, ideology and history.
It's interesting how a concept like human rights can be used to forge a sense of collective identity. It's like saying, we may disagree on politics, but we can all agree on these fundamental values that make us human.
Exactly. And this idea resonated far beyond Europe's borders. Remember those Soviet dissidents we touched on earlier?
Oh, right. Moyn talks about how their voices played a huge role in bringing human rights to the forefront of global consciousness.
Yeah.
But how did they manage to have such an impact? I mean, they were operating from within a repressive regime.
It's pretty incredible, right? I mean, figures like Andrei Sakharov and Václav Havel, I mean, they were incredibly courageous. They spoke out against oppression, they demanded basic freedoms, and they did so in the name of human rights. And their message resonated really deeply, especially with people in the West who were, they were looking for a way to challenge the Soviet Union without resorting to military force.
So it was almost like their personal struggles, their demands for just basic human dignity, it kind of captured the imagination of people who had the power to amplify their voices.
Absolutely. And it created this really powerful feedback loop.
Okay.
So the more these dissidents talked about human rights, the more attention they received from the West, and then the more support they garnered, the louder their voices became on the world stage.
It's a reminder that individual stories, individual acts of courage can have a ripple effect and contribute to large-scale change. But wasn't there also a shift happening in U.S. foreign policy around this time? Didn't something change with Jimmy Carter and human rights?
Yeah, you're right. Jimmy Carter's presidency was a really significant turning point. He made human rights a cornerstone of his foreign policy, which, I mean, this was a radical departure from the realpolitik approach that had dominated U.S. foreign policy for decades.
I have to admit, I'm not exactly sure what realpolitik means. Could you break that down for me?
Yeah. Realpolitik is essentially a pragmatic approach to foreign policy,
Right.
where decisions are based on practical considerations of national interest
Okay.
rather than, ethical or ideological concerns. So for Carter to prioritize human rights, even if it meant challenging allies or, jeopardizing strategic interests, was a pretty bold move.
So he was willing to put his money where his mouth was, so to speak. He actually took concrete steps to promote human rights, even if it meant going against the grain of traditional foreign policy.
He did. I mean, for example, he cut off aid to several Latin American dictatorships because of their human rights violations, which, I mean, this caused a lot of controversy at the time, but it sent this really powerful message that the U.S. was serious about holding countries accountable for their treatment of their citizens.
It seems like we've got this confluence of factors, all converging in the 1970s. You've got Europe searching for this shared identity. You've got Soviet dissidents bravely demanding their rights. You've got a U.S. president putting human rights front and center in his foreign policy. Were there any other sort of significant developments happening globally that contributed to this rise of human rights?
Yes. There's another crucial piece to this puzzle that Moyn highlights, one that's often overlooked in kind of the traditional accounts of human rights history, the dismantling of colonial empires.
Oh, that's right. The 1970s saw the collapse of many colonial regimes and the birth of new nations all across the globe. How did this wave of decolonization tie into the human rights movement?
Well, I mean, as you can imagine, the dismantling of these empires, while a positive development in many ways, also created a new set of challenges, right? Many of these newly independent nations struggled to establish stable governments and ensure basic rights and economic opportunities for their citizens.
So even though they'd achieved independence from colonial powers, there was still a long road ahead in terms of securing true freedom and equality for their people.
Exactly. And in this context, the concept of human rights starts to take on this new meaning. It's no longer just about, freeing nations from colonial rule. It's about protecting individuals from the potential abuses of their own governments.
That's a really interesting distinction. So human rights became more internal,
Yeah.
more focused on the relationship between a state and its citizens, rather than just solely on relationships between nations.
Exactly. And you see this shift, especially in the work of organizations like Amnesty International. They started to focus on, exposing human rights abuses that were happening within countries, shining a light on issues like political imprisonment, torture, restrictions on free speech. And they were really committed to doing this regardless of where these abuses were occurring.
It's remarkable how much the focus of the human rights movement evolved during this period. It broadened from primarily challenging colonialism to encompass these more internal struggles for freedom and justice.
Absolutely. And this evolution is still ongoing.
Right.
As we move into the 21st century, the human rights movement continues to grapple with new challenges and complexities.
Yeah. It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of this story, and I'm already eager to hear what Moyn has to say about the modern challenges facing human rights. I have a feeling it's going to be a pretty eye-opening discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dive into this last part of our deep dive into the Last Utopia. We've really been going through this whole unexpected journey of human rights.
Yeah.
From their surprising emergence in the 1970s to all these challenges they faced as they became, more integrated with existing power structures.
Right.
And now I think we're at this point where we're asking, the big questions about the future of human rights.
Yeah.
So if they're not this ancient, immutable force, but rather a relatively recent invention, as Moyn argues,
Yeah.
where do we go from here? What does it even mean for the future of human rights?
Well, Moyn suggests that this late emergence, while it allowed human rights to flourish, it also came with some baggage,
Okay.
some compromises that might actually limit their effectiveness in tackling some of these challenges of the 21st century.
Baggage, compromises. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, well, think back to what we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Human rights, at their core, they were meant to be this radical critique of power,
Right.
a challenge to the status quo, right? But in order to actually gain traction,
Yeah.
to achieve their goals,
Right.
they had to become more palatable, more integrated with the very systems they were initially designed to challenge.
So to make progress, they kind of had to play the game a little bit, even
Yeah.
if it meant compromising some of their initial radicalism.
Exactly. And that, obviously was necessary to some extent, but it also opened the door to some criticism.
Criticisms. Like what are some of the downsides
Yeah.
of human rights becoming more integrated with these power structures?
Well, one critique is that human rights have become too individualized,
Okay.
too focused on protecting individual liberties at the expense of broader social and economic justice.
So the argument is that they've kind of lost sight of the bigger picture, the systemic issues that create inequality and oppression in the first place.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Okay.
Another criticism is that human rights have become too closely aligned with Western interests.
Okay.
And they're often used to kind of justify interventions or advance certain political agendas.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a concern. I mean, it raises questions about whether human rights are truly universal.
Right.
Or if they've become a tool for one part of the world to impose its values on others.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. And whether or not you agree with these criticisms, they highlight, I think, some really complex challenges facing human rights in the 21st century.
So where do we go from here? I mean, if human rights are this invention, as Moyn calls it,
Yeah.
are we stuck with these limitations?
Mm-hmm.
Or can they be, reimagined, reshaped to better address the complexities of our world?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Moyn doesn't really offer any easy answer. But he does challenge us to think critically about the human rights framework.
Right.
He wants us to acknowledge its complexities, its contradictions, and its potential shortcomings.
So he's saying, like, don't just accept human rights at face value.
Yeah.
Don't assume that they're this perfect, unassailable ideal.
Exactly.
Instead, we need to see them as a work in progress,
Yeah.
a project that requires constant vigilance,
Yeah.
critical engagement, and a willingness to adapt.
I think that's right. And that's a powerful message because it reminds us that human rights are not a destination, but a journey.
Right.
They're not this set of fixed principles etched in stone,
Right.
but a living, breathing framework
Yeah.
that has to evolve to meet the changing needs of our world.
And that evolution requires us to be, informed, engaged, and willing to ask these tough questions about, what human rights mean and how they can be used to create a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this whole exploration of the Last Utopia, I keep coming back to one of Moyn's most thought-provoking statements. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that human rights are not an inheritance to preserve, but an invention to remake.
It is a very powerful idea.
It is. It leaves us with this challenge, this responsibility to take this invention, this powerful tool for social change, and shape it, mold it to meet the challenges of our time.
Yeah.
What does that look like? How can we ensure that human rights remain relevant and effective and truly transformative in the 21st century and beyond? I think those are questions we all need to grapple with.
I think that's a great takeaway from our deep dive today. It's
Yeah.
not about simply accepting human rights, as a given, but about, engaging with them,
Right.
questioning them,
Yeah.
and working to make them a more effective force for good in the world.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. The future of human rights is not preordained. It's a story that's still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping that next chapter. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.